It was an ordinary afternoon in a small roadside café just outside the city. The kind of quiet place where locals came to relax, drink coffee, and escape the noise of the world. The bell above the door rang softly. In walked Steven Seagal. There was nothing flashy about him that day. No cameras. No security. No dramatic entrance. He wore a simple dark jacket, black boots, and tinted glasses. Calm. Silent. Observing. He chose a corner table and sat down slowly, his movements controlled and unhurried. If you didn't know who he was, you might have assumed he was just another quiet man passing through town. But not everyone in the café saw him that way. Across the room sat three loud young men. Confident. Arrogant. The kind who enjoyed being the center of attention. One of them noticed Steven sitting alone. "Look at that guy," he muttered with a smirk. "Trying to look tough or something." They laughed. To them, he wasn't a legend. He wasn't a master of discipline. He was just an older, silent stranger who looked different. And silence, to insecure minds, often feels like weakness. One of the men stood up, pretending to stretch. As he walked past Steven's table, he deliberately bumped into it. The coffee cup shook, spilling slightly onto the saucer. The café grew a little quieter. Steven slowly lifted his eyes. He didn't shout. He didn't react emotionally. He simply looked at the young man, calm, steady, unreadable. For a brief second, something shifted in the air. The young man hesitated, just for a moment. But pride quickly replaced doubt. "Watch where you're sitting," he said sarcastically. Steven adjusted his cup carefully. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and controlled. "You should be more careful." That was it. No anger. No threat. Just a simple statement. But sometimes, the calmest words carry the most weight. The young men returned to their table, laughing louder now, trying to impress each other. Yet they kept glancing back at him. Because something about him didn't feel ordinary. And they were about to find out why. They thought he was just a quiet man, but they had no idea who they had just challenged. The laughter from the young men's table grew louder. Too loud. It wasn't natural laughter anymore. It was forced, exaggerated. The kind meant to humiliate someone. The kind meant to prove dominance. Across the café, Steven Seagal remained seated, calmly stirring his coffee as if nothing had happened. But the men weren't finished. "Hey, old man," one of them called out. "You some kind of tough guy?" A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Steven didn't respond. And that silence irritated them even more. You see, there's something about human psychology that's interesting. When someone refuses to react, it makes insecure people feel powerless. Loud individuals often depend on reactions to feel important. Without that reaction, they escalate. And that's exactly what happened. One of the men stood up again. This time there was no pretending. He walked directly to Steven's table and stood over him. "You didn't hear me," he said, leaning closer. Steven slowly looked up. "I heard you." His voice was steady. Calm. Controlled. No fear. No anger. Just awareness. That calmness felt like a challenge to the young man's ego. He lightly tapped Steven's shoulder, not hard enough to be considered an attack, but disrespectful enough to provoke. "You should show some respect," the man said sarcastically. Steven gently placed his spoon down. "You should try the same." The words weren't aggressive, but they were firm. Around them, phones quietly began to rise. A woman near the counter pressed record. A man at the window turned his chair for a better view. Everyone sensed that something was building. And here's something important to understand. Real strength doesn't shout. It doesn't brag. It doesn't need validation. But insecure strength, the fake kind, needs witnesses. These young men weren't trying to fight. They were trying to perform. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone mistake calmness for weakness? Maybe at work. Maybe at school. Maybe even in your own life? And before this situation goes any further, I want to know something. Comment below which country and city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story reaches around the world. Back inside the café, tension thickened. The young man leaned even closer. Or what? He challenged. For the first time, Stephen's posture shifted slightly. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal awareness. You should sit down, he said quietly. The other two men stood up from their table now, sensing entertainment. Or what? The first one repeated, this time louder. There it was again, ego demanding a reaction. And when ego doesn't get what it wants, it pushes further. The young man reached forward, this time grabbing the edge of Stephen's jacket. Gasps echoed softly through the café. Because now, it was no longer words. And sometimes, one wrong move changes everything. The moment the young man grabbed his jacket, the atmosphere inside the café changed. Conversations stopped. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Even the sound of the espresso machine in the background seemed distant. The grip wasn't extremely violent, but it was intentional. Disrespectful. Designed to provoke. And that's when something shifted. In one smooth, almost invisible movement, Steven Seagal stood up. There was no dramatic wind-up. No angry shouting. No warning. Just precision. His hand redirected the man's wrist. His body turned slightly. His balance shifted with calm efficiency. And before anyone in that café could fully process what had happened, the young man was face down against a table, his arm controlled firmly but safely, unable to move. A loud gasp filled the room. It hadn't looked violent. It hadn't even looked fast. It had looked effortless. The other two men froze in shock. One of them took a step forward, then stopped. Because something in Stephen's posture made it clear, this wasn't chaos. This was control. The restrained man tried to pull away. He couldn't. Relax, Stephen said quietly. Not angrily. Not mockingly. Just calmly. Struggling will only make it worse. And here's something powerful about that moment. This wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about humiliating someone. It was about boundaries. There's a major difference between aggression and defense. Aggression seeks control over others. Defense protects dignity without losing composure. Years of discipline teach something most people never learn. Real power is quiet. Stephen wasn't breathing heavily. His face wasn't tense. His movements weren't wild. He looked like a man adjusting a chair. The young man on the table, however, was breathing fast now. Panic replacing arrogance. The café was completely silent. Phones were now fully raised. Someone whispered, "How did he do that?" Another voice replied softly, "I don't even think he tried." And that's the thing about mastery. When someone trains for decades, movement becomes instinct. Calm becomes automatic. Reaction becomes controlled. This wasn't anger. This was muscle memory guided by discipline. Let me ask you something honestly. At this moment, if someone grabbed you like that, what would you have done? Would you have exploded in anger? Would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed calm and controlled the situation? Type stand if you would stand your ground. Type walk if you would leave. Because moments like this reveal who we really are under pressure. Back inside the café, the other two men looked unsure. Their confidence had disappeared. One of them tried to laugh nervously. "Hey, man, relax. It was just a joke." But it didn't sound convincing anymore. The man being restrained wasn't laughing. "Let me go," he muttered, embarrassment replacing bravado. Stephen leaned slightly closer, not threatening, just present. "You shouldn't touch people without respect," he said. No raised voice. No curse words. Just truth. And somehow, that felt heavier than any punch. Slowly, Stephen released the pressure and stepped back. The young man stumbled slightly but caught himself. He rubbed his wrist, eyes wide, not injured, just shocked. Because for the first time since they started this, he realized something important. He had misjudged the wrong person. But here's what makes this moment even more powerful. Stephen didn't smirk. He didn't taunt. He didn't celebrate. He simply adjusted his jacket. Calm again. Like nothing had happened. The room remained frozen. The balance of power had completely shifted, and yet there was no chaos. Only awareness. And that's when, from the back corner of the café, Someone finally said the words that changed everything. "Wait. I know who that is." Another voice followed. "No way." Phones lowered slightly as faces turned. The whisper spread from table to table. And in just a few seconds, the entire energy of the room transformed. Because they were about to realize. This was never just a quiet man. "Wait. I know who that is." The voice came from a young man sitting near the window. He had been recording the entire situation, his phone still raised halfway in the air. The café, already silent, seemed to freeze even further. "What do you mean?" someone whispered. The young man squinted, looking closely at the quiet figure standing near the table. "No, it can't be." Another customer quickly pulled out her phone and began searching. Within seconds, her eyes widened. "Oh my God, that's him." Across the room, the three arrogant men exchanged confused glances. "Him who?" one of them muttered. The answer spread softly at first, like a ripple in still water. "That's Steven Seagal." The name moved from one table to another. Steven Seagal. Martial artist. Film star. A man known for discipline, combat mastery, and decades of training. The same quiet man they had mocked minutes earlier. The young men's faces changed instantly. Confidence drained. Posture shifted. Eyes lowered slightly. You could almost see the realization hitting them, not just that they had picked the wrong person, but that they had misjudged him completely. And here's something interesting about human nature. We often treat people differently once we discover their status. Respect suddenly appears. Tone changes. Behavior adjusts. But the real question is this. Why does respect sometimes depend on recognition? A few minutes ago, to them, he was just an older, quiet stranger. Now, he was someone important. But Steven hadn't changed. He stood exactly the same way he had when he walked in. Calm. Silent. Controlled. The only difference was awareness. The man whose wrist had been restrained stepped back slowly, rubbing his arm, not injured, just humbled. You're that movie guy, right?" one of them asked awkwardly. Steven didn't answer immediately. He simply adjusted his jacket again and looked at the young men, not with anger, not with pride, but with something deeper. Disappointment. There's a powerful lesson here. True confidence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk into a room demanding attention. It sits quietly. And waits. Let me ask you something. If no one had recognized him, do you think their attitude would have changed? Be honest. Do people respect strength, or do they respect fame? Comment your opinion below. Back in the cafe, whispers continued. "That's really him. I've seen his movies. He's trained for decades." The energy that once felt aggressive now felt cautious. Even the young men seemed smaller somehow. One of them tried to recover his pride. "Well, you should have said who you were," he muttered, attempting to shift blame. "That's another human instinct. When embarrassed, people try to protect their ego by redirecting responsibility. But Steven finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and firm. Would it have mattered? The question hung in the air. And no one answered. Because everyone in that room understood the truth behind it. Respect shouldn't depend on reputation. It should depend on character. The cafe owner, who had been watching nervously from behind the counter, stepped forward. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked Steven. Steven nodded slightly. "I'm fine." He didn't exaggerate what happened. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't even mention the grab. Because to him, it wasn't personal. It was simply a lesson. The young man who had started everything avoided eye contact now. The arrogance that once filled his voice was gone. In its place was something far more human. Embarrassment. And maybe reflection. The cafe, once tense and divided, now felt united in a strange way. Not because of celebrity, but because they had just witnessed something rare. Controlled strength. Not explosive power. Not ego-driven retaliation. Just discipline in action. And that's when something subtle happened. The people who had been recording slowly lowered their phones. Because the story was no longer about a confrontation. It was about understanding. And the real lesson, hadn't even begun yet. Stephen took a slow breath. The young men stood there quietly, waiting. Not for a fight, but for what he would say next. Because in that moment, everyone realized something important. They hadn't just underestimated a man. They had underestimated what true strength looks like. And now, they were about to hear it. The cafe remained silent. Not the awkward kind of silence. The heavy kind. The kind where everyone is waiting for something meaningful to be said. The three young men stood in front of Steven Seagal, no longer loud, no longer confident. Just human. One of them cleared his throat, trying to regain some control of the situation. Look, we didn't know who you were. It was meant to justify everything. Stephen looked at him calmly. That's the problem, he replied. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. The words landed heavier than any physical move he had made earlier. And this is where the real power of the moment began. Because physical strength impresses people. But moral clarity transforms them. The young man who had grabbed him looked down at the floor. The ego that once fueled him had completely drained away. And here's something important about human behavior. Most disrespect doesn't come from strength. It comes from insecurity. People often test others not because they are powerful, but because they are unsure of themselves. Stephen slowly pulled out a chair and sat down again. Not in surrender. Not in dominance. Just grounded. You thought silence meant weakness, he continued. But silence is control. No one interrupted him. Because when someone speaks from experience instead of emotion, people listen differently. He looked directly at the young man. Strength isn't about proving you can hurt someone. It's about proving you don't need to. That sentence changed the entire energy of the room. Let me ask you something honestly. Do you think real strength is about fighting back, or holding back? Comment hold back if you believe control is true power. Comment fight back if you believe strength must be shown. Because moments like this reveal how we understand power. Back in the cafe, the young man finally spoke. We were just joking. Stephen nodded slightly. Jokes don't leave people uncomfortable. That simple response exposed the truth. There's a difference between humor and humiliation. One connects people. The other divides them. The second young man stepped forward. You could have really hurt him, he admitted quietly. Stephen's eyes remained calm. I didn't need to. And that is what separates training from aggression. When someone trains for decades, discipline becomes automatic. Reaction becomes measured. Emotion becomes secondary to awareness. Most people think martial arts is about fighting. But at its highest level, it's about avoiding unnecessary damage. It's about protecting, not attacking. Stephen stood up again, slowly. The young men tensed slightly, out of instinct. But he simply extended his hand. Not to dominate. To help. The young man hesitated, then shook it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it was powerful. Because humility is harder than confrontation. You're young, Stephen said. You have strength. Use it wisely. The words didn't sound like a lecture. They sounded like experience speaking. And here's the deeper human truth. Everyone makes mistakes. But not everyone learns from them. The cafe owner exhaled in relief. Customers began murmuring softly again. The tension had dissolved, replaced by something unexpected. Respect. Not because of fame. Not because of fear. But because of composure. The first young man finally looked Stephen in the eyes. Sorry, he said quietly. And this time, it wasn't forced. It was real. Stephen nodded once. That's enough. No long speech. No moral grandstanding. Just closure. And that's what legends understand that others don't. You don't need to win the room. You just need to control yourself. The young men slowly returned to their table, not laughing anymore, not performing. Thinking. Reflecting. Growing. Because sometimes the strongest lesson is the one that doesn't leave bruises. It leaves awareness. But the moment wasn't over yet. Because outside the cafe doors, Sirens could be heard in the distance. And once again, the situation was about to shift. The distant wail of sirens cut through the soft murmurs of the café. The tension that had settled like a thick fog over the room returned, this time with a different weight. People instinctively glanced toward the entrance, wondering who might arrive and what would happen next. Within moments, 2 police officers stepped inside, uniforms crisp, badges gleaming, and the familiar authority they carried filling the space. Conversations ceased immediately. All eyes shifted to them. The young men who had been mocking Steven Seagal minutes earlier now froze in place, unsure how to act. Pride had vanished from their faces, replaced by embarrassment and fear. As the officers approached, recognition dawned instantly. One of the officers' eyebrows shot up. "Wait, isn't that Steven Seagal?" he whispered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. The room seemed to hold its breath as whispers spread among the bystanders. The realization hit everyone, including the 3 young men, like a sudden gust of cold air. The quiet man they had challenged, underestimated, and attempted to humiliate wasn't just anyone. He was a legend. A master of martial arts. A man whose calm had carried decades of discipline, experience, and awareness. Yet, Steven didn't look up at the officers with expectation or arrogance. He remained calm, collected, and grounded, the very embodiment of quiet power. He didn't need validation. He didn't need to announce his identity. His presence spoke volumes. The officers exchanged glances, suddenly aware that this was not a normal situation. They approached Steven cautiously, respect replacing the initial assumption that he might be just another bystander involved in a scuffle. Meanwhile, the 3 young men sank slightly into their chairs, aware that authority had arrived, and with it, the consequences of their actions. But more than that, they realized that their humiliation wasn't only public, it was personal. Steven turned slightly toward them and spoke in his low, calm voice. "You've learned a lesson today. Let this moment teach you more than punishment ever could." The officers, now fully understanding the scenario, glanced at the young men, then back at Steven. They began quietly speaking to them, asking if anyone was hurt. But the point had already been made. No physical punishment was necessary. The lesson had already taken root. Here's a human truth worth noting. Sometimes, the strongest authority isn't enforced by power alone. It's demonstrated through restraint, composure, and moral clarity. People respect self-control more than force, and even authority figures recognize it. Let's pause here. Think about it. If you were in the young men's shoes, how would you feel seeing a quiet man, someone you underestimated, handle the situation with control and calm? Comment below. Forgive if you believe Steven made the right choice by not escalating further, or justice if you think consequences should have been enforced immediately. Back in the café, a few of the bystanders began murmuring among themselves. "He could have made them pay," one whispered. "And yet he chose not to." Steven glanced at the young men again. "Real strength," he continued, "is knowing when to act and when to step back. It's not about proving yourself to others, it's about proving it to yourself." The 3 young men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, absorbing every word. Their embarrassment deepened as they realized their actions had been reckless, not because Steven was physically stronger than them, but because he had mastered the art of controlling reaction, something they had never even considered. The officers quietly nodded in understanding. One of them commented under his breath, "That's a lesson for all of us." And as the tension in the room began to ease, something remarkable happened. The crowd, who had been watching nervously from their tables, started murmuring approval. People weren't cheering for violence or drama. They were cheering for composure, dignity, and restraint. Steven finally straightened his jacket and took a slow breath. "You all have seen today what respect looks like," he said. "It isn't demanded. It's earned, through actions, through self-control, and through humility." By now, the 3 young men were silent. Their lesson was clear. Not through punishment, not through threats, but through the quiet demonstration of a man who had mastered his own mind, his own reactions, and his own strength. As the officers began taking notes, speaking softly with the young men, the bystanders whispered and shared what they had witnessed on their phones, recording, commenting, and sharing this moment already becoming unforgettable. And here's the takeaway for everyone watching. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones we see in physical action, but the victories of restraint, understanding, and moral clarity. Because while the young men were being corrected in a matter of minutes, the lessons they learned would last a lifetime. Stephen had not only defended himself, he had demonstrated why legends aren't measured by how loudly they fight, but by how quietly they command respect. The video surfaced online within hours. A single phone recording, shaky, imperfect, raw, captured the entire encounter in the cafe. Steven Seagal, calm, composed, almost motionless at first, then precise, restrained, and commanding. The moment where he had redirected the young man's aggression without throwing a single wild punch became the centerpiece of the clip. Within minutes, comments began to appear. Millions of eyes from around the world witnessed the story. People weren't talking about the confrontation itself. They were talking about the lesson. The quiet dignity. The strength that didn't need to be flaunted. "Wow, that is control. That's real power," read one comment. "Legends don't announce themselves," wrote another. "This is what discipline looks like," someone else typed from halfway across the globe. The clip spread quickly on social media platforms, each share carrying the lesson further. In every country, from the United States to the Philippines, from the UK to Australia, viewers paused and reflected. The story transcended borders. People didn't just watch a confrontation. They watched a human lesson in strength, humility, and respect. Meanwhile, the young men who had started the chaos were forced to confront their actions in public. Apologies were issued, genuine ones, tempered with humility. They admitted their mistake, acknowledging that they had misjudged a quiet man based on appearance alone. But Stephen didn't engage. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. He had already made his point, and the lesson had reached far beyond the walls of the cafe. The world was listening. Here's the human truth worth reflecting on. We live in a society where strength is often measured by volume. Who speaks the loudest, who reacts the fastest, who can intimidate most effectively. These traits are assumed to be proof of power. But true mastery is subtler. It is quiet. It is calm. It is measured. And it is far more effective. Steven Seagal demonstrated that strength without control is meaningless. Humility without courage is hollow. But combine the two, composure and courage, and you create an influence that commands respect without demanding it. People watching from their homes were inspired. They shared their own experiences of being underestimated, of situations where silence had been mistaken for weakness, and they reflected on the importance of self-control in everyday life. A viewer from London wrote, "I thought I knew what strength was. Now I realize it's not in the fist, but in the mind." Another in Manila commented, "He didn't need to fight to win. He won because he stayed in control." This story became more than just a viral moment. It became a lesson in psychology, in humanity. It reminded everyone that appearances are often misleading, and quiet men, or women, may carry far more power than anyone expects. Even the authorities who arrived at the scene recognized the depth of the lesson. They had witnessed firsthand how respect could be earned without fear, how authority could be acknowledged without force, and how dignity could prevail in moments where chaos seemed inevitable. And for those young men in the cafe, the lesson extended beyond embarrassment. They had seen humility in action, discipline in motion, and strength expressed without aggression. They had learned something far more valuable than intimidation or fear. They had learned awareness. As the video continued to spread, people began posting side-by-side comparisons of past action clips, martial arts highlights, and interviews of Steven Seagal. But what resonated most wasn't the celebrity or the cinematic achievements. It was the man himself, quietly demonstrating a universal truth. Real power is invisible until it is needed, and true respect is earned, not demanded. In a world obsessed with proving oneself publicly, his story reminded people that controlling your reactions, acting with integrity, and choosing restraint over impulse creates a legacy that lasts far longer than any viral video. And while the world celebrated, Stephen remained the same quiet man he had been when he first walked into that cafe. No interviews. No public statements. Just a calm presence, a subtle nod to those around him, and the knowledge that he had made his point. Legends are not measured by the volume of their actions. They are measured by the impact of their restraint. They are measured by the lessons they teach silently, simply, and effectively. And in this story, Steven Seagal reminded everyone of one enduring truth. Power without control is meaningless, fame without humility is fleeting, and respect earned through dignity lasts forever. If you believe that real strength comes from calm, composure, and integrity, type legend in the comments below. Share this story with someone who could use a reminder that true power is quiet, and subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Because sometimes, the most unforgettable lessons come not from who shouts the loudest, but from who controls themselves the most.